Welcome to the Yale Centre for British Art's online series, At Home in Conversation. I'm Rachel Stratton, Postdoctoral Research Associate in the Curatorial Division at the Yale Centre for British Art. I'm delighted to welcome our panel today. Rachel Federman is Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Drawings at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. Jay Clarke is the Rothman Family Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago. And Cynthia Burlingham is Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles and the Director of the UCLA Grunwald Center for the Graphic Arts. Today's program is titled Bridget Riley's Drawings from Studio to Museum and is in conjunction with the Center's exhibition, Bridget Riley, Perceptual Abstraction, on view until Sunday, July 24th. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for the panelists, and they will be answered at the end of the program, but please just feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the program. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking on the icon on your navigation bar. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Bogosit, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. So can I invite Rachel, Jay, and Cindy to turn their cameras on and join me? Thank you. So I'm really excited to be able to have this discussion. It seems like there is a bit of a moment for Bridget Riley in the US at the moment, kind of looking back on her career, perhaps really for the first time, certainly in a long time. And while the Center's exhibition focuses primarily on painting, it's really wonderful and exciting to have an opportunity to discuss her drawing practice, which is such a rich and generative aspect of her practice, and one that perhaps hasn't received the same level of kind of scrutiny as the rest of her work. So to kind of open the discussion, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this project came about, how you became interested in Riley's drawings, and how this collaboration between the three institutions happened. And let's start with you, Jay.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Jay Clarke, calling in from Oslo, Norway, believe it or not. When we were thinking of this exhibition and thinking of how amazing the drawings of Bridget Riley are and how they really hadn't been featured in an American exhibition in a long time, we were thinking along the lines of her 90th birthday, which of course has now passed, but due to COVID rescheduling, we had to move the exhibition back a year. But when we were thinking of partners, of course, the Art Institute of Chicago has a great tradition of exhibiting works on paper, a one study room that supports students and scholars to come in. And the two institutions that came immediately to the fore were the Hammer and the Morgan, just thinking about how they have such strong missions in exhibiting works on paper, specifically drawings. And so the partnership of the three curators came together very quickly, and soon thereafter, as we will see, followed a trip to Bridget's studio in London.
I should say that when we arrived in London, it was in October of 2021. So still in the middle of the pandemic, for me, at least my first European trip in 2 years almost. And we hadn't met Bridget before. And what was amazing about Bridget was she greeted us all, and she greeted us individually with some remark or question about our institutions. And her knowledge of our institutions was amazing. She greeted me and said how much she liked our Rembrandt painting that was shown at the National Gallery in London, and what a brilliant picture it was. it happens to be a picture of Juno, the goddess. And it must have been in a show at the National Gallery in London over 5 years ago. And so she not only remembers this painting, she looked at the label and knows it belonged to the hammer, which I just found absolutely miraculous. And it shows she is so deeply engaged with the history of art and with institutions. Then she proceeded to read an amazing quote from Constable. So it started right off, and I must say for myself, in the middle of the pandemic and sort of the despair of that time, it was just one of the most uplifting, amazing experiences. We spent about 3 days at 3 different locations choosing drawings that represented the span of her career, and talked with her a lot. Not enough, of course. Now that I haven't talked to her since last October, I have so many more questions.
Something else that she did that really stuck with me was when we were seated around a table and I was sitting opposite her, and she was describing to us her process of beginning a drawing, and she sort of used me as her subject, and she articulated verbally how she would do a drawing of me. It was just wonderful.
Mm-hmm. And then another colleague was wearing a yellow jacket and a purple scarf, which she remarked upon as being a great color combination, which so
I want to talk a little bit now about her, her drawing practice, get into some of the actual works. And we'll start with the earliest works. And one of the kind of interesting things about Riley is that she really began, working in the life drawing studio at Goldsmiths College, where she studied under Sam Rabin. And this is something that is kind of often referenced, I think, in scholarship about Riley, but it's never really that concretely kind of tied to the rest of her practice or the kind of the work that we've come to identify her with. And it's something that I think your exhibition promises to do in quite a brilliant way. And Jay, you wrote about this for the catalogue. So I wonder if you could talk us through some of the works that she was producing as a student and how those are kind of tied to the rest of her practice.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we're all going to deal with slightly different aspects of Bridget Riley's work today. And I will, as they say, begin with the beginning. This is an early self-portrait by the artist before she entered art school, when she was at college studying a variety of things and drawing at the same time. And as Rachel said, often her early works are not considered, and they may be exhibited from time to time, but they're rarely considered in the scholarly press and the scholarly literature, the secondary work, the writings on her. And it's usually discussed. Her breakthrough moment, which we'll be talking about, is in the 1960s when she goes to abstraction. But there's good, 15 years of her youthful work is actually quite fascinating, and I think tells us a lot about where she goes, about her education, about what she's interested in, as well as the real struggle she had moving into abstraction. It wasn't like she was born suddenly this abstract artist that we know and love. So again, here we see this early self-portrait by her, and the face is quite beautifully sensitively rendered in graphite, which is basically a pencil. But one part of the drawing I find quite interesting is the part where we have the ear. It basically is governed by the color of the sheet of paper, but our eye in some ways fills in the rest. So the blank areas, I think, are equally as important as that are drawn. So after this moment, Riley moves from Ladies Cheltenham College, as Rachel mentioned, to Goldsmiths College. And she was really at a loss of where to begin. So she thought she would start with drawing. And she did exclusively drawing for over 2 years. She wasn't working in painting. She wasn't really working much in color unless Conti Crayon happened to be in color. She worked exclusively on drawings. If we can go to the next image, please. And one of the things that I think is fairly well known about Riley is that she was heavily influenced by Georges Seurat. When we look at her abstract work, it may seem a little bit surprising, but she was highly influenced by Impressionist and post-Impressionist artists, among them Seurat specifically. And this painting, A Sunday on the Island of La Grande Jatte, is housed at the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's a work of art that Bridget Riley had a reproduction pinned to her wall at an early moment in her career. So it's very important to her. And when the artist first moved from black and white into color, she began by making copies or versions of Georges Seurat's paintings. His very pointillist technique. Right now, we're seeing it from very far away, but if you get up close, any of you have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, gets quite close to the painting. It's really made up discrete dots, sometimes of contrasting colors, sometimes of equally paired colors. So we see her moving from reproductions, copies of Seurat's work, to creating her own pointillist work. So we have an example of this on the left called Blue Landscape from 1959. And I think it's interesting to note that she moves from this painting into complete black and white monochromatic abstraction within less than a year. So the change is quite sudden in a way. And what we have here, again, are these pointillist dots, but they're done a little bit more, they're more broadly conceived. But again, these contrasting colors next to one another, blues next to greens, next to yellows, in this painting on the left. If we can move to the next slide, please. And one thing that became quite important to her at Goldsmiths College, as Rachel said, working with Sam Rabin, was what she called tonal works. Now, tonal works she usually executed in Conti crayon. On the left, we have black pastel, but Conti crayon and pastel are relatively similar. And she's obviously not interested in capturing something very specific in this preparatory drawing or the painting. She's really concentrating on the lights and the shadows. And what she often said, it was the tones in between black and white that interested her the most. So what that has to tell us. So we see shades of the pastel going up and down in the landscape on the bottom, see them going side to side and in different directions. The true blacks are really the vertical black element on the far left and this very strangely anthropomorphic tree in the middle, but everything else is really shades of gray. And it was through tonal drawing, the artist said, that she really began to understand an impetus towards abstraction, because it was really about finding the darks and the lights and what was in between. Next slide, please. Thank you. And it was Georges Seurat's Conti crayon that really interested her at the moment, and the tonality of them. Here we see a stunning self-portrait in the exhibition on the right that Riley made in 1956, which is also in Conti crayon. And in Seurat's drawing, which is at the Art Institute of Chicago, we see him working with a very sharp point of the Conti crayon. And in the background, if you look carefully, it's really just a group of squiggles across the sheet of paper. There are some areas that are drawn quite densely, the factory behind the boat on the shore, but everything else is just absolute web of beautiful lines and squiggles. And the artist does this. Riley looks at this and creates her own manner of it. And here we see, interestingly, 3 horizontal stripes behind her, which are in various shades of grays. And the artist who's reading a book or doing a drawing, I'm not exactly sure what. And one moment I love particularly is where the boot or the shoe doesn't quite meet the pants, and there's either socks or her leg there. So she's really interested in, and you can very much see her move into abstraction at this moment. They're becoming more and more about bands of various shades. Next image, please. Another artist who very much interested Riley was Piet Mondrian. And here we see a drawing here, compositional study. And it's not his Broadway boogie woogie or his very linear paintings that she was studying at the time, but his drawings of landscapes, which at the time, now we think of him really using black and white and colors in his paintings, but he made a beautiful series of drawings. And we very much see the connection here in her Trees in Blossom on the right, another Conti crayon drawing, where the water below, not unlike Mondrian's, is really described in very broad stripes and striations down at the bottom. And the trees don't really hold leaves, but we very much know that they're trees with leaves, and there's a path in the background. But again, it's all very, very abstracted at this moment. Next image, please. Actually, can you go back one, Rachel? One of the things, I was doing a Zoom call asking Bridget Riley some questions, and she was talking about this drawing. And she said, oh, and I love the little houses in the background. They're so quaint. And I thought, well, she must be looking at something. There aren't any houses. And then I got the drawing in front of me, and sure enough, there's this discrete grouping of houses that I always thought were bushes. But of course, she remembered them. And she has this amazing visual acuity. So next image, please. Oh, quite astounding group of works, and we'll have a selection of them in the exhibition, are a group of wax crayon drawings she did. And at the time, her teacher gave her someone that he was making on his own, these wax crayon instruments. And if you look at these two together, at first they seem to have absolutely nothing to do with one another. But if you look closely on the right, this untitled work, oops, sorry, that's me reminding myself to shut up. So I will shut up soon. But you see these circles on the right, and then you also see rectangles and horizontal stripes. And then if you look at the drawing on the left, you see again 3 bands of horizontal stripes and the circles that form the white cloud in the background and the bushes in the front. So she's really doing something in color, very much does in black and white later. Next image, please. And then we're going to hear more about these from Cindy and Rachel. But she starts moving more and more towards color, and her work's gray on the left. It might at first look like it's versions of gray, but there's quite a lot of red in there as well. And then on the right, she expands her vocabulary of color to just gray, blue, and red, and various mixtures of those as she moves from the outside to inside to a more vibrant tonality. Next 2, please. And then in terms of the use of color, one thing that's quite hard to describe, I've been writing my labels for the exhibition, it's very hard to describe in a label, much easier to see, is what she calls the crossover. And she starts one color in a very heavy band, and then eventually crosses over into another color, which you can see here in the detail on the right. Next 2 slides, please. These are the last 2 to talk about. Just in terms of the connection with her early work, one of the things you see here in these works from the 90s is these vertical stripes, which we all know and love from her work. But the vertical stripes are here bisected by diagonal stripes and triangles, as well as the drawing on the right, which is again, is just pencil and gouache on paper. These verticals are then interrupted, and these colors are interrupted by these curves that move throughout the work of art and disrupt the eye and disrupt the connection of colors. So I will now, moving from her early drawings, pass the torch to the other Rachel, Rachel Federman.
Jay.
Sorry, yes, go ahead, let me.
So this is a great photo of Bridget in her studio in the early 1960s. And Tom Crow, in his contribution to the catalog, writes about this really seminal moment when she's sort of at a loss. She's not quite sure how to proceed with her painting. And she has these drawings that she's been working on, and she has some work in a portfolio, and she sort of finds herself sheltering under the canopy of Gallery 1 during a rainstorm. And Victor Musgrave invites her in, and he looks at the drawings, and, you know, sort of history is made from there. It results in her first solo exhibition of her breakthrough black and white works in 1962. And so here you can see all of these black and white studies pinned up on the wall, and some of these we'll actually have in our show. Next slide, please. So this is really sort of the moment in the show where we go from those early representational drawings, including those where she's really experimenting with the idea of tonality and contrast, to these purely abstract works. So this is a moment, 1961, and I think what's really wonderful about seeing these works on paper as opposed to the paintings, which you can see at the wonderful Yale show now, is that you can see all of those little marks of handling and facture, and also the pinholes. And, one of the wonderful things about the way that Bridget works is that her practice is very recursive, and she keeps a lot of her drawings because she wants to refer back to them. And so, the drawings that we're showing are primarily from the artist's studio. And so I think it's a really intimate glimpse into the way that she works. She keeps these in a very intentional way because she might return to them someday. She's always looking at her previous work. Next slide, please. So here's another example. And this is something that when we looked at it together with Bridget, she actually sort of sighed and said, "Oh, I don't know if I can part with it." This is a study for the work, Movement in Squares, that really made her reputation, where she takes a regular form and she begins to compress it. And the results, when you look at it, in the museum at Yale, of the finished painting are just so remarkable. And again, here, just to be able to see her working through these permutations on paper and with all those little signs of touch and facture is wonderful, because Bridget's approach to painting is very much not to have signs of facture. She never considered having her work produced mechanically. It's always produced by hand, but following Movement in Squares, she begins in her studio practice to have assistants complete her paintings. And so the drawings really become the index of the artist's process. And then it becomes very important to her that she experience a kind of distance from the painting while it's being made, in much the same way that a spectator would have a certain distance from the painting. And so with the drawings, we're really getting to see the artist's touch in a way that you don't see with the paintings. Next slide, please.
I think it's, sorry, just to interrupt at the moment, it's also really that anecdote that you gave about her not being sure whether she could part with it. It really is so interesting to think about what relationship these drawings have for her, the emotional pull for her in a way that perhaps she doesn't have so much with the paintings, because she needs that objectivity. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's true. So this is a work, this is a work that appears on the cover of our catalog. Sorry, I'm going to run and hang that up.
The joy of live Zoom webinars.
Exactly.
You never know what'll happen.
Sorry, I think I'm the only person in the world who still has a landline. So this is a work that you'll see on the cover of the catalog for our show, Scale Study for Shift. And what's really wonderful about studies like this is she has all of her annotations, and you can really see the way that she's putting shapes through their paces, which is how she refers to the way that she develops her compositions, is that she'll take a shape and then she'll put it through its paces. So here you can see her taking a triangle form and slightly adjusting it and modifying it along these lines, which look like staves, like musical staves. And I actually quite love that, because I think that the idea of composition, almost like a musical score, is a nice analogy for her works on paper and the way that she's viewing them. And the painting is sort of the performance, and all of the things leading up to that are sort of the composition of the score. Next slide, please. And so here you can just see a sort of side-by-side of the work on paper and the finished painting. And so the relationship between the two, which is, it's not a one-to-one quite in the same way that the study for KISS or Movement in Squares was. Next slide, please. So this is a work that I really love, and it's a little bit difficult to see in reproduction here, because what she does is she creates these framed edges, and she does her shading on the interior, and then she continues these undulating lines outside of these frames, so that it really gives you a sense of a kind of the skeletal structure and then the shading. And so they appear as sort of two discrete parts of her process. Next slide, please. And that work bears a close relationship with this very famous painting, Current, which appeared on the cover of the catalog for The Responsive Eye, which was a show in 1965 at MoMA that really made Bridget's reputation on the international scene. And so one of the things that I was interested in about her work, and her works on paper in particular, is how she navigates this relationship between tradition, and as we just heard from Jay, there's a lot of tradition and attention to craft and the history of art in her work, but it's also quite radical. And so how do we sort of hold these two things at the same time? Next slide, please. So in a work like this, for example, she's creating this illusion almost like of glare or reflection. And so I started to think about, what are the things that she's doing on paper that could have been done in other mediums that artists were working in at the time? And so the analogy that I thought of was, artists who were working in television, for example. And Bridget actually worked for 4 years for J. Walter Thompson, which was a prominent advertising agency. She worked there between 1958 and 1962. So just at the moment that she's having this sort of breakthrough moment into abstraction. And, I wouldn't want to assume anything, but I think that one has to wonder about the connection between her exposure to this commercial sphere, which was also very much intermingled with fine art at the time, and the developments in her work. Next slide, please. Here are 2 more works where you can see her playing with this idea of reflection or glare, and then also with her wonderful annotations at the bottom, which are they're very practical. I mean, they're very workmanlike. She's really just giving herself instructions for how she wants to proceed, maybe in the next study or in the finished work. Next slide, please. So the analogy that I sort of alighted on was, there was this logo for the BBC, which was developed in 1953, and it was in use until 1961. It would have been ubiquitous, so certainly she would have been aware of it. But what's so fascinating about it is that it actually rotates. And I was trying to figure out a way to show you a moving image of it, but I couldn't quite do it. It actually rotates. So it was a kinetic logo. But the way that it was produced was that the designer, Abram Gaines, actually had a model made, and the model was filmed, and the light was projected across the model so that it appeared to be illuminated at periods over time. And so I thought about how Bridget was exposed to these kinds of moving images and kinetic images, and the novelty of television, but she's so committed to the traditional medium of pencil, ink, gouache, paint, that she's in some ways she's figuring out ways to have these effects, but to have them in a more traditional medium. Next slide, please. So this is a work that you can see in the Yale show, Uneasy Center, which is actually a round work, so redolent of Marcel Duchamp's rotor reliefs. But again, the rotor reliefs were made for motion. They were intended to be rotated, whereas Bridget's work is intended to have its impact only in 2 dimensions and only as a static object. And so she's really sort of pushing the limits of what 2-dimensional art can do. Next slide, please. And another sort of comparison, Nam June Paik, and all of the ways that he was showing that you can have a sort of destabilized version of television, sort of exposing how unstable, in fact, broadcast television really is and the medium is, and exploiting it to make really wonderful art. And, it's just sort of makes me think of how disruptive the effects of Riley's work is. And, she might have taken her work into other mediums, she might have taken her optical interests into other mediums, but so devoted was she to these traditional mediums that she didn't even consider it. Next slide, please. So here you can see her starting to transition into color. And it's a coincidence, I'm sure, but 1967, which is the year that she makes her transition into color, is also the year that the BBC starts broadcasting in color. But, again, you can see that there's something about this work, and this is from the cataract series, and a cataract is an impediment in the field of vision, that she's really interested in this idea of disruption or interruption, and again, but trying to figure out ways, and you can see her really working through it here on the page, trying to figure out ways to do this on the sheet, or on the canvas. Next slide, please. And here we have these really remarkable works. The one on the left is actually in the collection of the Yale Center for British Art, and it has that twisting effect that Jay mentioned. And the one on the right is going to be in our show. It's really fantastic study for a work called Halcyon. And here you can really, I think, get a sense of how Bridget's interest isn't in representing anything anymore. She's really interested in replicating the experience of seeing something like a sunset or an extraordinary reflection in water. And she's really interested in replicating that experience through abstract means. And she's using color as a means of achieving that. And so her interest is really in what happens between the viewer and the painting. Next slide, please. And here again is another work on the right from the Yale's collection. And we have a couple of these in our show too. It's a little difficult to read, but the work becomes almost, I want to say Baroque. It becomes almost so beautiful, so lyrical in the 60s and then going into the late 1970s. Next slide, please. And here you can see another really beautiful example. And again, just the way that it's a kind of disruption in the field of vision, but she's achieving all of this with very simple means. Next slide, please. And then what's interesting is in the 1980s, she makes a decision. She had this kind of incredible Baroque, lyrical, undulating waves, and she sort of pulls it back and expands her palette and decides that she's going to go back to stripes because the stripes allow her to do the kinds of things with color that the undulations are almost a distraction. And so you see her really constantly trying to think about different ways to use these effects of color and light and what are the shapes that are most conducive to those effects. And that was it for me. I'll pass things to Cindy now.
Thank you, Rachel. As I said, her drawings are working a lot with notes, also with movable collage elements that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But to think in general about her drawings is that they're explorations. They are testing grounds for paintings. They're usually many drawings for one painting, and she will call them studies. She said about her drawings, studies aid accessibility. And she also said, I think many years ago, I don't want there to be anything mysterious about the way I work. So I loved that as a paper person. I love seeing this process that she goes through, and that changes and revisions are very much part of the inquiry. And as Rachel mentioned, she keeps those drawings around because they are those kinds of memories of those explorations and those testing grounds. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a study for Arrest 3 in 1965. It's pencil and gouache on graph paper with collage. She uses graph paper quite often. This is an early drawing, but it still has notes about color and tone. Can I see the detail, please? Okay, you see also that she has a band here that she's taped off to the side. You see that quite frequently in her drawings. There's a collector in Los Angeles who loves Bridget Riley. And I said, oh my God, this drawing has tape. And he said, oh, I love tape. So you're getting deep into paper people here. May I have the next one, please? So you see that she has these notes, one that says this one, on those two different tones, and the range between this and white. She has making notes to herself in one of the many drawings that she will do in advance of a painting. Next one, please. And it's hard to see, but the note at the top says revise from reading from top left to bottom right. And then you see how she's extended those lines and has numbers and notes to herself on that. Next one, please. So yeah, you can see that a little bit better there. And I do not know what all of these mean, but it would be quite a conversation I would love to have with her about each one of these. Next one, please. So this is Egyptian stripes with revisions from 1983, a color drawing of stripes, obviously. It's pencil and gouache on graph paper with masking tape. And you can see that, next slide, please. I think it shows it better. This is my own photograph I was taking. You see that she has these two stripes cut out, one green and one pink, this kind of olive green and a pastel pink. And they're movable. So if you think about how these stripe drawings work, that color is interactive. So a color can appear to change according to its neighbors. So this way she could move these and get those different relationships while she's in the process of doing a drawing. Next slide, please. And you can just see that very close up here. Next drawing, please. Next slide. Yeah. And there's the pink. Okay, next one, please. So for the last 30 years, I believe, plus and minus, Bridget has done collage. As you can see, even the earlier drawings had collage elements, but this is on a much larger scale. She has extended that kind of improvisational nature of her practice to create large-scale drawings out of cut paper that has been painted, and assembles them both in drawings that are smaller scale, but also of the same scale as her actual paintings. Next slide, please. So you can see her working here with that rhomboid zig paintings of the early 1990s. They're a combination of verticals and diagonal shapes. They've been actually likened to brush marks. The cut paper shapes are painted and then made at the scale of that final painting, so they can be manipulated at will. And she has been doing this for quite some time. Next slide, please. So this is a movement taken from 21st October, Bassax, study B, from the year 2000, and it's pencil and gouache on paper with collage. This is from a time where she started to move outside of the rectangular picture frame. And you can imagine how these cut papers allow her to do that. She was doing this often in preparation for wall drawings, where the shapes did move outside of that frame. And this kind of sweeping motion of that curve that goes outside the picture plane. It's a layering technique that allows her to weave forms and colors together in space. And you can also see, like, especially in the pink, that the same colors are next to each other. They're different shapes that combine to make new shapes. Next one, please. This is a drawing, second revision of July 26th from 2002 to 3. It's pencil and gouache on paper, but it has overlaid tracing paper. Can I see the next one, please? You can see it a little bit better here, how that tracing paper is overlaid and has notes on it. And next slide, please. Something says as is, where she draws out that arrow to show what she wants to keep as is. And then there's color notes and also movement notes. I think that even in these late drawings, you can see that she's always been true to a statement that she originally made about copying Seurat, which is about how much more you can see by drawing rather than just looking. So I think that that applies to these as well as her earliest ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. I mean, it's so interesting to see these collage works. And one of the things that I recently read in one of the exhibition catalogs from Davis Werner, I think, was that, in 1985 and 6, just after she'd sort of had this period of doing the Egyptian palette series, and she felt kind of a bit stuck with the stripe, and it was actually collage that kind of got her out of this period of sort of not knowing where to go, because it opened up a whole new dimension of the kind of shallow depth, which you see in those works from the 80s, kind of mid 80s onwards. So that it's really fascinating to have a look at, to actually see some of the collage works that she's using.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other comments about this before we move on? So before we open it up to questions, and I do want to do that fairly soon because we've only got about a quarter of an hour left, but we did title this program From Studio to Museum because one of the things that we wanted to do was actually talk not only about Riley's drawing practice, but also how it has come to be an exhibition. And so to finish up, I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about how you intend to display these works and perhaps some differences between the institutions. And we'll start with Jay because it's going to the Art Institute first.
Hello again. This shows you how we mock up exhibitions. We usually have a plan, and then we cut up the glamorous job of cutting up little teeny tiny pieces of paper that are maquettes. So if you walk in where it says exhibition title, that's the main entrance. And in the first gallery, which has quite high ceilings, we want to have a sort of survey of the artist's work throughout her career. And one of the things that the artist likes to do is sometimes hang in groupings. So that's what we plan to do in this area, precisely because we have high ceilings, to have groups of the 60s works, groups of some color works. And then as you move back, what says AL 126. This is where we'll have all of her early figurative works and some drawings that are in series moving toward a final painting. And if you go down to where it says 124B, the rest of the exhibition is really broken into sort of thematic sections to help the viewer who may or may not have ever seen her work to sort of understand the meanings behind it. So this is really about the concept of the study that, as Rachel Federman mentions, she calls her drawing studies. The next gallery, which is 124A, is really about stripes and curves and what those stripes and curves built on top of one another, what they signify. Then if we go all the way up to 127A, this is really about color and what the artist thinks about color. So we have the works from the 90s and 2000s, and then across the wall, those bright crayon drawings of nature that she did in Lincolnshire near where her family lives. And then the final gallery, 127A, the artist and I selected works from the Art Institute of Chicago's permanent collection that very much speak to her practice. Pierre Bonnard, Henri Matisse, Edvard Munch, Jura, and Paul Klee, and Mondrian. So we have examples of all of those artists' works in that corner gallery, which will be painted a slightly different color just to signal these are not works by Riley. So that's Chicago. About just over 90 works in the exhibition.
And the hammer.
Okay, so we have about 90 works in the exhibition as well. This is a view. I'm afraid I like Jay's chips much better than my view, but this is a view of our Works on Paper gallery that is a brand new gallery. It just opened in February. It's about 3,000 square feet. It has fairly low ceilings, but it adjoins our Works on Paper study room, which has glass doors, and you'll be able to, it'll open next fall and open well in advance of when Bridget's show is. But what I love to see is an exhibition that's a formal exhibition with framed works, but then also glass doors into a study room where you can go look at a box of Rembrandts in, without being framed and sit there at a table or with a class. So we see these spaces as very aligned. I have to say that I have not actually arranged the exhibition yet. So what you see here is the first try to make sure everything fit. But what I'm imagining actually is to have the earliest works on that center wall, which I see as kind of the linchpin and the beginning of it. And then to do more chronological hang around the rest of the room. So we'll be working on that very soon.
So here's my version, and the entrance is at the bottom center. And so I also thought, similar to Jay, but on a smaller scale, is to have that wall facing the entrance as a sort of a sampling of excellent works from across her career. So an early black and white at the left, and then in the center, that incredible drawing called Halcyon that you saw earlier. And then on the right, one of the later works using those more organic shapes, color work. And so because we have a big open space and we adjust our walls according to the exhibition, this is what I thought for now. And so the show would sort of begin at the left with the early works and then ranging clockwise around the gallery, generally chronological. And so you'd have the black and whites sort of back center and on that temp wall in the back, and then ranging around to the color works. And I think it's kind of fun to see it this way because you can see how the scale changes so dramatically. How she begins with the black and white works, they're so small, and then the works quickly become so large as she moves into color.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now because we have got a few questions. I'll start with one that actually relates, I think, to the exhibition layouts you just showed. Someone's asking about the viewing distance. She says, the viewing distance is critical to the visual effect. Is that taken into account in a specific way in the installations?
I was going to say, Rachel, I think that I would say that holds more for the paintings than the drawings, which are going to demand to be looked at closer because a lot of them have these notations.
I agree. I mean, you have to get close up to these in order to really see what she's doing, but you will allow enough room, 5-6 feet, to back up and see them. But most of them, are fairly small scale as opposed to the paintings. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. They need visibility. You need to get back and get close. And so the only gallery I really did significant group hangs is that first gallery, precisely because the walls are high. So you can get a middle line and still get close and get farther away. So that's a good question.
There's a question here, which is, I think, comes up very often when talking about Bridget Riley, which is about assistants. Can you talk a bit more about Bridget Riley's studio practice? Does she use assistants? Does she use guides to create the perfect geometric shapes?
Well, when we were at the studio, we actually met one of her assistants who was in the process of mixing colors for her. So yes, she does use assistants. And, as I mentioned earlier, she has used assistants throughout her career, and having that kind of sort of a sense of distance from the work is very important to her. Actually, even thinking about having that viewing distance, that she wants that too, while the works are being painted. But she does have studio assistants who help in the preliminary processes too, with things like mixing paints.
One of the things that's quite interesting is that a lot of her studio assistants come from the graphic arts, I think. And so that kind of really relates back to what you were talking about, Rachel.
Right, that the finished paintings aren't meant to have that sense of touch that the drawings have, and they're meant to look, more flat, matte, without touch. Although what's great about her paintings is that, she could have them produced in a way that they would have no sense of facture at all, right? She could use mechanical processes, but she doesn't, and so she always does want that hand quality to it, it just has to be a very particular kind of hand.
Yes, exactly. You can, if you get up close to the paintings, at the center, you can see that it's hand drawn. There's never, despite using tape in the preparatory work, she kind of never uses tape to do the stripes in the paintings. And so you do get that kind of slight human quality, even with the reduction of facture. So there's a question here about the sentimentality of these drawings to her. I think a lot of artists tend to throw away their preparatory studies, drawings, and notes once they've realized the final work. Why do you think Riley's studies were so sentimental to her?
I think in part because she goes back to them, she reflects upon them. And I think in part because this is her hand, the art drawings are so well known to be the closest intellectual connection to the artist's hand, and possibly because she doesn't execute the final painting, someone else does. So this is the closest thing she has. And one of the things that we wanted to do in this exhibition, at many points we thought about bringing in loans, important works from other collections, and we decided there'll be a couple of loans from our local friends and collectors in the exhibition at the 3 venues, but we wanted to keep it a real studio show. These are the artist's works. This is precisely what is behind. And again, we have another sense of that touch. You can call it sentimentality. That's a question. I think that's certainly an appropriate word. But I think it's really exciting to know that all of the works that are on view in the 3 exhibitions and in the 3 venues are from her studio and that she's kept behind.
I think also,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. With movement of squares, which is what Rachel was talking about, this very small drawing, it's such a moment for her. That drawing, 1961, represents that moment. So it's the moment of learning and realization so many years ago, and you could just see when she looked at it that was all coming back. So I think it's sentimentality, but also it's very much about process and learning and having that available to her. So I think that was a particularly sentimental one, maybe, but the rest of them are around for real reasons that have to do with her practice, her process.
Yeah. There's quite a specific question here. During your visits with Bridget, did she reflect on her recent paintings and the works with circles in very reduced close tones? I was wondering if you had anything to say about the restraint she shows in these and the test they set for the viewer, given the choices of artists at the latter years of work to perhaps move to the opposite, thinking of Seurat's circus paintings he made at the end of his life. So I think that the question is saying she has kind of moved towards restraint, whereas you see often with other artists like Monet or Seurat, a kind of freedom towards the end of their life. And does anyone have any comments on that?
I think that's a very good question. And we did see some of those very, very subtle colors sort of being worked on when we were in the studio. They're very, very subtle. I think it's because she's really always, moving on to the next thing. And so I think it's sort of like, it's not teleological, her practice, because there is this sense of returning to things that she's done in the past. For instance, circles, that's something that she returns to and that she, started looking at in the 60s and then came back to. But I think that, she's always looking to sort of challenge herself and the viewer. And so it's really about sort of, again, that kind of space between the painting and the viewer. And so if it's challenging, I think that maybe that's kind of the point, if it's presenting a kind of optical challenge. So I don't know really what else to say about that, but I do think it's a very good question.
It seems to be that she has kind of posed these almost kind of problems of representation for herself throughout her life, and they kind of change through her career, and they change. And, perhaps if you work in that way for 60 years, where it's kind of almost, the actual production of the paintings is not scientific at all, but this kind of slightly scientific way of kind of posing a problem of color or form and trying to work through it, and perhaps you kind of become more and more attuned to that as you go through your career, rather than sort of breaking out from it. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So there's a few questions about when these exhibitions are happening, which I will give dates at the end. There's one question about how to access the catalogue for the Yale Centre for British Art exhibition, which can be done through our website. If you go to the website and click on the Bridget Riley Perceptual Abstraction link and scroll down, you'll be able to get a link to our digital catalogue there. So, just to kind of end, I wonder if for the last question, which is from me, I could ask, do you have a sense of how she has kind of received this exhibition that you're planning, which kind of is very revealing of her process in a way that many artists are quite guarded about? And, so I'm interested in her thoughts and what you've been doing.
She was so receptive and so open. And I think that the question about how other artists don't, they might destroy their drawings. Many artists certainly wouldn't show these drawings necessarily. There's a whole range. But that she, as I said earlier, she doesn't want there to be anything mysterious about the way she works. And that she is very, very open to what her interests are, her influences are, her process. And that there were many drawings in her retrospective at the Hayward Gallery that were not in the catalog and were such, I think, a hit of the exhibition, as I understand it, that the realization of how much interest there is in her drawings, I think perhaps became clear, and that it was important to have an exhibition that was devoted exclusively to drawings.
And with I was just going to say one thing about the early works. I think that with the student works, it's something that she wasn't interested in showing at other points in her career. But I think as she's gotten further along in her career, I think she wants people to recognize the continuity in her practice, and so that there was this figurative landscape tradition that she was referencing, and that improbably the work that she's producing now is an extension of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say the one word I would use in terms of the interactions we've had with her would be generous. She's incredibly generous, curious. She loves the conversation about the works of art. I mean, she was so excited that we have a little study of the Grand Jatte, that's going to be hanging, and so excited about. But then on the other hand, she doesn't want to control how we hang them. As you see, we all have different hangs. So she's very generous in how she shares her information. And one of the things she said to me on our Zoom call was precisely the notion of sharing, especially at this point in her career. She really wants to share and participate in the conversation. I think the fact that she's so generous to the British Museum in allowing students to come in and use their study room and study after original objects. She's very engaged with students and the general public, physically engaging with drawing. So she's a very generous and very, very intellectually curious at the same time.
I think that is the perfect place to end this program. Thank you so very much to Rachel, Jay, and Cindy for this really kind of rich discussion. Just some dates for everyone. So Bridget Riley Perceptual Abstraction is on display at the Yale Center for British Art until Sunday, July 24th. And Bridget Riley drawings from the Artist Studio will be on display at the Art Institute of Chicago from September 17th, 2022 through January 16, 23. At the Hammer Museum from February 5th through May 14th, and at the Morgan Library and Museum from June 23rd through October 8th. So without further ado, thank you very much again. And
Thank you.
Thank you.